So this was kind of a long one that takes place when I was a student at UTEP. That's the University of Texas at El Paso, for those of you that didn't know. And it happens to be one of the best places to study engineering in the entire country, let alone the Southwest. But what many of you will know is that El Paso is right across from the Rio Grande from its sister city, Ciudad Juarez. Back in the early 90s, there was none of the beefed-up border security that exists now. Sure, the cartels were operating, and maybe I'm just remembering this through rose-tinted glasses, but there just wasn't the same kind of senseless violence that affects the region today. The students that lived in El Chuco, what many Mexicans called El Paso, had a lot of respect and love for Juarez, for one big reason: the drinking age. In a place where the drinking age was and is 21, we were like an hour's drive away from a foreign country where we could drink tequila and Corona until we passed out, and no one would bat an eyelid. Getting over the border was a piece of cake, too. I can't speak for today, but back then you could just park your car on the American side, walk over a bridge, pay the toll, and boom, you're in liquor heaven. And now you understand why UTEP gets some of the highest application numbers in the country. About the same time I was making my college applications, a buddy of mine went off to join the Marine Corps. We hadn't seen each other for years, so when he got back from a deployment to the Gulf, we organized for him to come down to El Paso for some much-needed catching up. Only, he too had heard about the drinking age loophole and was insistent that we take advantage of it. Naturally, I agreed. So we're over in Juarez, getting hammered and jamming with this mariachi band in some dive bar, having the time of our lives. And somehow we get separated. At this time, I should add that I'd only ever been over to Juarez myself like twice previously, so it's not like I know my way around too well. Stupidly, I decide to go looking for my buddy. Thanks to the booze, I can't quite remember how, but I ended up in this big square that's hosting a large gathering of people. Me being drunk assumes that this is just some kind of party, so off I go to join in with the revelry and practice my bad drunk Spanish. Only it's not a party at all. And although the bad vibes come a little too late, boy, they hit hard. I remember trying to just get out of the crowd, feeling super panicky when I came across a large truck, Policia, stenciled on the side. There were Mexican cops just tossing people into the back, beating them with batons before bundling them inside. I'll never forget the way this cop looked at me. Pure hatred in his eyes as he lunged toward me. I'm not Latino or anything, but I do have dark hair and brown eyes, not exactly the most obvious gringo imaginable. So the fear I felt when I realized this cop just assumed I was a Mexican rioter or something, Jesus Christ, I'll never forget that feeling of helplessness.
Yo soy americano, por favor, no. Por favor, yo soy americano.
I screamed, but my accent always was horrible. The cop didn't understand. Maybe he did, but he just didn't care. But his only response was to beat me with the black baton he held tight in his fist. Before I knew it, I was stuffed into the back of a hot, stuffy police wagon with the group of terrified Mexicans. You have no idea how much it sucked, sobering up inside an overcrowded Mexican jailhouse where I could barely understand a single thing anyone was saying. From what I can remember, it was just this huge, concrete monstrosity on the outskirts of the city, and it was not like any U.S. county jail I'd ever heard of. Instead of smaller cells or whatever, they basically just had these huge, caged-off yards that seriously had like hundreds of dudes thrown into them. I mean, some were like half a football field and still seemed overcrowded. At first, I thought I might be in luck, that they discovered that I was an American tourist during the booking process and send me on my way. No harm done. My heart sank when I realized that there was no booking process as such, that they just throw you in with hardened criminals and deal with you when they're good and ready. I was screwed. I was pretty sure I'd end up getting beaten up, stabbed, or worse. But I was wrong, and thank God I was wrong. The only dudes who bothered to pay attention to me were just curious as to how I'd ended up there. Otherwise, the other prisoners just talked and sometimes fought amongst themselves. My new amigos and myself could barely communicate, but thanks to the little bit of Spanish I took in high school, I could sort of get by. They offered me smokes and through a series of complex hand gestures established that they'd have my back for the presumably short time that I'd be there. Shout out to Miguelito. You're probably not reading this, but I'm eternally grateful. I end up being let out in the morning when they finally bring me out for booking. I thought the cops might be at least a little apologetic, but nope. They didn't care. Just sort of shrugged before showing me the door. So I'm a mess when they let me out of the jail. I'm hungover, I've not slept at all, and I'm a nervous wreck from the entire experience. All I can think about is getting to the border and getting home. I mean, I worry briefly about my Marine buddy, but then I remember he'd been to war and could probably look after himself. I know it was selfish, but like I said, I was in a bad way. Only when I got to the toll bridge to get back to the States do I tap my pockets and realize, at some point during my stay in the jail, somebody had stolen my wallet and passport. I thought I was going to empty my stomach right then and there. I mean, when people talk about feeling sick with fear or whatever, that stuff is for real. I know it wasn't the case, but in those few moments I thought I'd be stuck in Mexico for the foreseeable future. Now, I do love Mexico, but it is not the place to be stuck with no money and barely any Spanish, and there was no way I was going to spend a night on the streets in Juarez. So, with my heart in my mouth, I started walking towards the toll booth, hoping he might take pity on me and believe my story. Sometimes I think that the craziest part about the whole thing is that border security actually did believe me. They cross-checked some stuff, called the UTEP to ensure that I was in fact a student there, then just let me pass. Turns out that the whole losing your passport thing happens way more than I'd first thought. I think I was just too exhausted and scared to show any real emotion. I just trudged back to my car and drove back into El Paso, promising myself that I would never, ever drink tequila again. Back when I was a student, I went on a university-sponsored trip to Singapore. With over 5 million people of varying ethnic backgrounds packed onto a small island off the coast of Malaysia, Singapore is one of the world's last great city-states. Everything about the trip was just phenomenal. A pure sensory assault for a bumpkin from the Midwest like me. Singapore is a foodie's heaven. Street food hawker culture was practically born there, and the locals take a great deal of pride in preserving traditional recipes that have been around for literally hundreds of years. It's clean, there's very little crime, and despite having a reputation as a heaving metropolis, the island has a handful of nature reserves and public parklands where the masses can detox from city life for a few hours before returning to the fray. It's paradise. At least, it was, until the last night we were there. Being the last night, we decided to head over to Clarke Quay, which happens to be Singapore's main attraction when it comes to nightlife. It's a little more upmarket, with the kind of clubs that do bottle service and VIP booths, but we figured since we'd be slumming it all summer that we should go out with a bang. Clark's is a bit of a walk from the rented apartment I was sharing with my other people on our course, so we were stopping into little bars along the way, and by the time we got there, we were smashed. It was a brilliant night. Singapore never ceases to be a feast for the senses, but it was wild. We all drank way too much, and the last thing I remember is getting into a taxi after puking up a bunch of flavored vodka. I'm not entirely sure how I got into my apartment, but I must have done okay, because a couple of hours later I woke up fully clothed, in my own bed, reeking of vomit and booze. It was my phone buzzing irritatingly against the bedside table, caller restricted showing on the screen as I picked it up. Confused, I answered groggily, asking who was on the other end. I didn't recognize the voice. It certainly wasn't one of my fellow exchange students, and in fairly broken English, the voice on the other end asked if I knew 2 people he named. They were both the names of the people I shared the flat with when I answered yes. People on the other end of the line began talking in Malay to each other. I couldn't understand what they were saying at all, so I asked again who was calling. The Malay man refused to give me his name or the location of my friends. All he would say was that he was with them and that they were alive, for now. The words chilled my blood, and with my head spinning from the hangover, I assumed the worst. They had been kidnapped. They had gotten blind, drunk, and lost in Singapore, and had managed to get themselves kidnapped by the local mafia. That's when I freaked out. I started shouting down the phone, telling them that I was going to call the police, that they'd be dead men if they laid a hand on my friends, that I was an American and I'd make sure that they'd be in prison for the rest of their lives for this kidnap. The guy just laughed. Honestly, the eeriest, most spine-chilling laugh that I'd ever heard in my life. And what he said next made my head hurt. "We are the police, sir. Your friends have been arrested." So it turns out that a pair of our numbers stupidly decided in their drunken stupor to walk back to the hotel along the waterfront. Unbeknownst to them, they ended up wandering into some highly restricted military area around Singapore Harbor. How they even got into somewhere like that is beyond me, but according to the police, that's just what they did. They're wandering around like morons, making a bunch of noise and generally being idiots, when, out of nowhere, a bunch of Singapore Marines surrounded them with weapons drawn and take them into custody. They hand them over to internal security, Singapore's equivalent of the FBI, where they're basically going to be charged with spying for a foreign power. They were separated and interrogated. One guy said guns were pulled on them in order to get them to fess up. They were taken to the walls of the ports and forced to explain how they scaled them, even asking if they had left any surveillance equipment behind the harbor. One cop told one friend that the other friend had already confessed, so they might as well confess too. All kinds of horrific, barely legal stuff was pulled on them, probably just to make an example of a couple of drunk Americans. When the police hung up on me, I called around the rest of the foreign students to tell them what had happened. It caused a full-on panic. The police over in Singapore can be particularly brutal and cruel, as I knew too well, and there was a rush to ensure that our two arrested friends wouldn't end up like that kid in North Korea that got beat up so bad that he died. I'm not comparing the two countries, but I don't know. We were panicking, like really panicking. We were calling up every police station in Singapore as well as the American embassy, asking everyone we could if they knew the fate of our friends. We had also made quite an extensive number of friends and contacts during our time there, and despite what our arrested friends experienced, Singaporeans can be exceptionally friendly, welcoming, and loyal. Our local friends went to work for us, using their knowledge to get to the heart of the problem. We think someone messed up their job at the port that day, left a gate open, and rather than admit fault, they would get these young students to take the fall. Thankfully, neither of them gave up because, God knows, the punishment for espionage in Singapore at the time was most definitely death. I suppose this story isn't as scary as some of the others, ones that involve actual local crimes, murders, and the like. Maybe none of us were really in danger, but the feeling of powerlessness we felt that night, the pure fear of realizing just how small we really are, how helpless we can be, I'll never forget that. So please, if you go traveling or on vacation to someplace far, far from home, be on your best behavior. Not everywhere is as free or as fair as the United States, as terrifying as that may sound. Have you guys heard of Murphy's Law? It's the rule that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And boy, is that a real thing. A couple of years back, I was in Bogota, Panama with a close friend of mine. First night there, we went out drinking with a group of people we'd met at the hostel we were staying in. I met a girl, we got talking, and well, we happened to find ourselves looking for a quiet spot to get some personal time in. You see where I'm going with this. We're walking and chatting, just being drunk and silly as we're wandering along this dusty road when we come to a gas station and realize we're pretty lost. I decide I'll go in, buy some smokes, then ask the attendants there how to get back to our hostel. So I'm inside, drunkenly fluctuating between Spanish and English with the two attendants when the girl I'm with pops inside. Apparently she's found us someone who will take us back to the hostel, so I apologize to the attendants without getting directions and follow her outside into the forecourt. Only it's not a taxi that the girl has found. It's just some Panamanian woman with a white Chevy. But I'm not one to refuse the kindness of a stranger, so at first I don't make anything of it and just get into the car. But when I look at the driver, I start realizing that what we did was a very bad idea. She looked high as a kite, and I'm pretty sure I could see a little coke dust around her nostrils. But by that time, she'd already driven off, and it was sort of too late to say anything. Not only that, but her car reeked of alcohol. I mean, it seriously smelled like a distillery in there. After some driving around, it becomes obvious that the woman is completely nuts. She actually starts doing coke while she's driving, in between rants in Spanish that seem to verge on manic episodes. Me and my gal pal are a little put off and asked to be let out. Driver pulls over and the girl, who is sitting in the front, jumps out. I'm just about to follow suit when the driver turns to me and says in plain English, "I lost my kids today. Stay with me a little while, will you?" This was a few years ago, and I have grown up a lot since, but drunk me decided that I was making a great decision by staying in the car. I'm on the edge of blackout in a brand new town, and so, for a while, I don't notice that this drunken woman is driving me way out of town. She makes a phone call, and then a few minutes later she pulls the car to the side of the road. I'm not joking when I say the largest man I had ever seen gets into the back of the car. He's Panamanian and thugged out from head to toe. He has dead eyes and coldly stares at me without saying a word. My drunk white Canadian self is sitting in the front seat. Through the liquor haze, my brain is screaming, "Dude, you're in Panama. No one knows where you are. You're alone with this terrifying human who hasn't spoken a word and a clearly messed up cokehead girlfriend." So I pull out my phone, thinking now is a good time to get a hold of my buddy back at our hostel, but it's dead. Yep, I'd forgot to lock the screen before putting it in my pocket, and it had died. Stuff like that is why I hardly drink anymore. So we are driving further and further out of town. The houses are getting big and spread out. We pull into a house that has Greek columns in the entryway, and I am thinking to myself that I've been kidnapped. I'm absolutely terrified at this point, and maybe because I was so scared, but I just got out of the car and followed her inside. I didn't want to do anything crazy. I had no idea how she'd react if I just ran away. She takes me inside of this huge house that's just dripping with drug dealer chic. I mean, it really did look like whoever owned the place was trying to build a replica of the Tony Montana mansion from Scarface. Marble columns everywhere, huge garnish paintings of tigers and stuff like that. We walk into one room where, sat at this huge dining table, is this really twitchy-looking Panamanian dude. He rises to greet me like we're long-lost friends or something, calling me brother and actually hugging me. I knew he could tell how out of depth I was, and I got the impression he was enjoying it. He offered me coke, weed, you name it. I politely declined them all and in a very roundabout way asked why I'd been brought here. He cuts to the chase and tells me he's a very successful drug runner with a network of contacts from Panama City to Michoacan, and that he has a favor to ask me. You know the way cartoon characters do like a big gulp when they're anxious or scared? Not a cliche. That actually happens, and the Panamanian drug runner has to stifle his laughter when it happened to me. He tried to calm me down, assure me it wasn't a big deal, but then, without breaking a sweat, he explained that he wanted me to smuggle a kilo into the States for him. I think I just totally zoned out when he was explaining how I'd do it, imagining myself in an orange jumpsuit, my parents quietly crying as my sentence is read out. There was no way I could go through with something like that, but I didn't think that was what my host wanted to hear. I pretended I was into the idea, asking how much money I'd make from the run, whereabouts in a vehicle you could hide so much. Then I told him I'd be back in touch within a couple of days to confirm the departure date. He seemed delighted, gave me a burner cell phone he could call me on, then told the cokehead woman to drive me back into town. The very next day, I told the guy I was staying with that I was leaving. I didn't even bother to get in touch with the girl that I'd hooked up with the night before. She was drop-dead gorgeous, and I ghosted on her harder than a gay Casper. I was too scared to keep the phone, but too scared to throw it away. I had gotten it into my head that the runner could use it to track me. I only tossed the thing when I was back over the border in the US. Maybe I've watched too much Breaking Bad, but I have zero regrets. I can imagine how much money that guy has, and I know some of the messed up things people will do for money. Besides, he could have employed the weird logic and say I stole from him by not returning the phone. I don't know. I just didn't want to take any chances. I have never been back to Panama since. Sometimes I stop and think of the smallest little actions and how they have huge consequences. Meeting the wrong girl, getting into the wrong car, all can have the most disastrously unimaginable consequences, and I guess next year, I'll just try Canada. Today's episode is sponsored by Dashlane. In today's world, everything requires a password. Even worse, each one of these has their own set of very specific requirements. One special character, one number, one capital letter. It's really a mess. I definitely feel this when accessing every form of little social media app login related to running the YouTube channel and podcast. How awesome would it be if you could throw all of these into just one app? That's where Dashlane comes in. Dashlane is a multi-platform and multi-function secure password and digital identity manager that takes the stress out of your everyday login struggle. Gone are the days of remembering an endless list of login credentials, credit card info, and clicking that dreaded forgot password button to reset yours for the 50th time, as this one service can remember them all for you. All it takes is one master password to access your virtual and secure vault that you can add not only logins, but also secured notes, online checkout information, personal ID cards, and contacts. Even better, with Dashlane Premium, you get access to their VPN, dark web monitoring, secure password generation, and complete seamless info synchronization across all of your devices. If password security is important to you online, I highly recommend trying them out. I've been using it for about a month or so now, and it's by far the best password manager that I've used to date. Check out the link in the description, www.dashlane.com/read. That's www.dashlane.com/READ to try it out for free on your first device for life. A few years back, my dad passed pretty suddenly. Heading back to our hometown for the funeral, my two younger sisters and I were reunited for the first time in years. It felt amazing, feeling petty sibling rivalries just fall away once we realized what was truly important, being family. We get chatting on the night of the wake, reminiscing and stuff, when we make the joint decision to go on a family vacation together. A few months down the line, and we've somehow managed to get the three of us to agree on a location, somewhere our dad has always talked about, with great affection, a place called Veradero in Cuba. He'd taken our late mom there on a belated honeymoon a year or so after they'd married, and the place was filled with happy memories for them. Maybe, just maybe, we could visit Veradero and feel a connection with her parents' past. So myself and my two sisters, Rose and Jackie, boarded a flight at Toronto Pearson that was headed directly to Havana, Cuba. Seeking to escape another damp, squib Canadian summer for the sun-soaked beaches of the Caribbean. We were excited beyond words. It was the first real vacation any of us had taken in years, and we really had gone all out for it. But it took about an hour before we wanted to leave. We landed in Havana, and the weather is looking like it's about to turn. It was very hot, and the sun was sweltering, but on the horizon was the biggest, most intimidating collection of storm clouds I'd ever laid eyes on. I mean, they were huge, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a Hollywood disaster movie. When we met our driver outside the airport, he explained in pretty good English the storm wasn't expected to hit Cuba too hard and that it should be cleared up by morning. And he was wrong. Over the course of the 2-hour drive to Veradero, the storm began to encroach, so that by the time we reached the actual resort, heavy winds had been battering the buildings to the point that the roof tiles were scattered all over the place. We were getting pretty concerned by this point, but the resort bar is still open and doing good business thanks to the weather, so we decided to grab a few drinks to pass the time. Mojitos, daiquiris, cubanitos. We sampled pretty much everything the menu had to offer us. Big mistake. By the time we leave to go back to our rooms, we're pretty smashed. Spirits are high despite the rain, so we're laughing and joking, singing songs in our bad Spanish, when all of a sudden, Rosie slips on a piece of roofing tile and goes down hard. Well, she doesn't exactly slip. According to her, an initial slip on her flip-flop on a damp, loose piece of tiling causes her footwear to become stuck. This kinda whipped her leg back, causing her to land on it with all her weight. We hear the bone snap as clear as day. It was horrific, but not as horrific as Rosie's screams. It took about 30 minutes of screams, tears, and panicking resort staff before the Cuban ambulance finally showed up. Some people make a big deal about the quality of Cuban healthcare, but I can assure you, the reality is quite different. The ambulance was literally just a can with a wheelchair in the back. No stretcher, no monitors for vital signs, nothing like we were used to back in Canada. What's worse, the driver was a doctor himself. The hospital was short-staffed that their own doctors were forced to drive the emergency vehicles themselves. Speaking of the hospital, we were horrified to find out that the closest clinic was over 45 minutes away in a place called Matanzas, and when we get there, it's worse than we could have imagined. The whole place is flooded thanks to the rainstorm, and we certainly weren't the only ones to suffer an accident because of it. The place was heaving with wounded and injured people. There were bloody palm prints on the walls, smears of blood on the floors where people had been dragged inside. The hospital staff were working so hard, but if there just wasn't enough of them, every single one was rushed off their feet, looking like they were about to snap under the pressure. Rose is still groaning in pain as we wheel her down flooded corridors. The doctors driving the ambulance were very kind and his English was almost perfect, but he just didn't have the medicine to properly dull Rose's pain. What's worse, we were doing all of this in our bikini tops. Nothing but wrap-around towels to cover up our lower halves. All these Cubans kept looking at us like crazy gringos or whatever, wondering why we were dressed for a party in what was obviously a crisis. The whole thing was stressful and embarrassing. We hadn't even converted our money yet. When the staff wheel Rose into the X-ray room, my jaw drops at how terrible a condition the machine is. It looks like it was made in the 50s or something. It's ginormous, rusted, and looked like it might come crashing down on whoever was unfortunate enough to be under it at the wrong time. Another doctor arrives. They complete the X-ray. Then the doctor tells us they're going to try to set Rose's broken leg without any anesthetic. I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. None of us could quite believe what he just said, but in his similarly near-perfect English, he explained that the hospital was short on anesthesia and were saving it for high-priority patients. What could be worse than a broken leg? We weren't sure, but the doctor was insistent that Rose would not be receiving any anesthesia. I cannot begin to describe the screams I heard. Jackie and I became so upset that a hospital security guard forced us to wait outside the room. The only seat available was next to an unconscious Cuban man. He was barely breathing, his head lolling back into his chair. I was pretty sure he was dying. Finally, after they set her leg, the doctor administers propofol just to knock Rosie out cold. They then explain they don't have the tools to perform any complex surgery required to properly set Rosie's leg, and we needed to get home, and fast. The next flight back wasn't until 8 p.m. the next night. Add the fact that the only wheelchair on the resort was too small to barely function. Our dream vacation had literally turned into a waking nightmare of pain, sleeplessness, and soul-crushing panic. We made it back in one piece, but Rose now has a permanent steel rod in her thigh and has been strongly advised to have gastric bypass surgery in order to reduce to a weight her weak leg can support. Please be very, very careful when you're on vacation. Many areas of the world are not nearly as fortunate as we are, and it can be quite a shock when you're face to face with that sort of deprivation. I would hate to think that anyone would have to suffer like my sister did, ever again. I was 19 when I first landed in Ho Chi Minh City, barely a grown man. Before that, I'd never even left the UK, and Vietnam seemed like the most exotic place in the world to me. Feeling like Neil Armstrong landing on an alien planet, the humidity that hit me in the face as I stepped off the airplane was unbelievable. How could people live in that heat? I couldn't even imagine. But live they did. In tiny, arterial streets and wide sunflower-lined avenues, millions upon millions of Vietnamese made their way around the city on little mopeds and scooters. My cigarette-smoking taxi driver filled the car with thick, billowing fumes, beeping the horn so regularly that it could have been Morse code. I recoiled when he began bellowing viciously out of the window in Vietnamese at any two-wheelers that came in too close. It was a sensory overload. Alien sights and unfamiliar noises, exotic scents both putrid and pleasurable. It was almost a relief to arrive at the small, dingy hostel I'd be staying at for at least a couple of nights. I quickly developed a taste for Vietnamese food. Loud, vibrant flavors and some strangely familiar forms. Vietnamese beer was pretty good too, yet it was the night that brought Saigon to life. Neon signs and blaring speakers from shrines and temples. Vietnamese go-go dancers gyrating to lyrics they couldn't understand. Fried meat and incense filling the air with sweet, delicious smells. Street vendors sold fruits that looked like props from a science fiction movie. It was incredible. But maybe I got a little too confident in my new home away from home. So Vietnamese weed is cheap, like really bloody cheap. Not as strong as some of the stuff you can find in the UK and the States, but for the price, it's fantastic. It's also readily available. You can rock up to some little Vietnamese dive bar and pay the bartender to nip out and grab you a bag. It's really that easy. Only this one night, my usual connection isn't in work. I try to ask the owner where the bartender is in my crappy Vietnamese, but he doesn't understand, so I give up and decide to find myself a new person to pick up from. Something you should know about Ho Chi Minh. It's not uncommon for someone on a moped or a scooter to just cruise up next to you on the pavement and offer you a lift somewhere. They'll be like, "Hey man, you want beers, ladies, weed, ecstasy?" Most people just laugh and decline politely, with the Viet hustlers just taking it on the chin and shouting bye-bye as they drive off. But when this dude rolls up and gives me the same routine, I nod and ask him if we can drive me somewhere to buy some smoke. As I expect, he smiles, nods, and tells me to hop on. After we're driving for about 15 minutes, I notice that we're actually heading out of the city center. Not just that, but we seem to be heading way out into the suburbs, which in Vietnam is basically just jungle with houses interspersed between thick patches of foliage. I didn't mind the journey really, as long as he didn't try and gouge me for it, and find much more quality stuff if you go out into the country where there's not as much demand. My driver says we're headed to a bar he knows, but when we pull into the driveway of this bar, it's anything but. It's literally just someone's house, a 2-story building with like a porch out front. He tells me we've arrived and I should wait on the porch for him to get my gear for me. Me being me, I just sort of assumed I either misheard the guy or there's been some other kind of miscommunication, probably on my part. So I do as he says, sitting in a white plastic chair on this house's porch while the owner comes out and starts talking to the driver. But when he sees me, he's absolutely effing fuming. He starts growling stuff at the driver, pointing at me and then at the driver. I didn't need to speak Vietnamese to know that I'm definitely not welcome here. But to my confusion, the two just go inside and leave me be. I'm getting pretty impatient after about 20 minutes goes by and I'm still just sat there, waiting on these two guys to come out with my smoke. Worried I'm being ripped off, I get up out of the seat and start wandering towards the doorway of the house, trying to get a look inside. But there's noise at the entranceway to the driveway. 4 youngish Vietnamese guys are staggering up the path, obviously pretty drunk. When they see me, they make the older owner's reaction look tame. They're not happy to see me, drunkenly jabbering in Vietnamese and making some pretty aggressive hand gestures. I'm backing off up the porch, hand raised before me like this I'm no threat to anyone kind of way, but they just sense the weakness and ramp it up. One is pushing me, the other is actually trying to stick his hand in my pockets to rob me. All the while the other two are like half goading them on and half trying to throw punches and kicks at me through the melee. I'm convinced I'm about to be robbed and battered by a gang of angry Viets, and that I'll have to walk hours back into Ho Chi Minh without a penny to my name. And that's when I hear it. There was this loud, echoing crack that caused the Viet lads to scatter away from me. I look up and the older owner of the house has stood there holding a bloody, smoking gun in the air. He then proceeds to aim it at the gang of Vietnamese lads, screaming stuff in Viet at them as they back up the driveway, absolutely bricking it. I honestly thought he was about to shoot one of them, right in front of me, and as much as I'm kind of ashamed to admit it, I sort of wanted him to. I actually found myself wanting this fella to just smoke one of those absolute ratbags trying to pick on some lonely, lost Westerner. I hate bullies, I always have. These fellas just legged it up the drive though, tails between their legs. I'm still shaking as the owner starts talking to me in Vietnamese. I have no idea what he's saying, but it's some kind of sort of explanation for what just happened. To this day I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm guessing they were just some neighborhood thugs, come to pick up some smoke as I had, who decided that they didn't like what they saw. Simple as that. With trembling hands, I take this huge bag from the owner, who then refuses to take my money off me. He's batting it away and pushing my hand back towards me, in this really overt gesture of keep this, you probably need it right now. And I did. You have no idea how scary it is when something like that happens in a foreign country. The feeling of utter confusion, helplessness, and fear are amplified because you stick out like a sore thumb. The one thing worse than some horrible misfortune is horrible misfortune you're not able to ask for help with. For my 18th birthday, my mom and dad organized a trip to Ireland for me and 2 friends. My dad's family had emigrated to Canada after the Second World War, and my mom also had some Irish blood, so it was always a dream of mine to visit the old country to gain a greater connection with our cultural past. My dad actually still has relatives in Belfast, in the far north of Ireland, which is technically still part of the UK, and still keeps in touch with them. So a big part of the trip was connecting with these relatives, having them show us around, treating us to some traditional Irish delicacies, like Guinness and, more Guinness. So after about a week or so of touring, Dublin, Limerick, and Cork, we headed up north via train to stay with my distant cousins in Belfast. The meetup wasn't scheduled until the early evening, and it was still quite early in the morning when our train arrived, so me and my 2 girlfriends ended up having some time to kill. Turns out Belfast is pretty cool, with a lot of stuff to see and do, so we had no worries about keeping occupied until the evening. So we're out doing a little shopping and seeing some sights when this young-looking guy walks up to us out of nowhere and strikes up a conversation. Being young girls, a cute Irish guy talking to us turned us into blushing idiots. He's telling us how he's not from Belfast, that he's only in town to do a music video shoot for his band. This now turns the fawning factor up to 11, and we're practically drooling over this tattooed Lothario as he regales us with tales of tour bus antics and wild rock shows. Eventually, to our absolute delight and amazement, he tells us we're all gorgeous and that we're perfect to star in their music video with them. He explains it'll be like a group thing, with a band playing in the abandoned warehouse space while their fans party around them. So when he asks us if we have an hour or two to spare to come and be part of the shoot, we jump at the chance. He asks us to follow him, and without so much as a second thought, we do. But here's the thing. I've always been a good judge of character, and something didn't quite feel right to me. I don't know what it was at the time, but something just didn't add up. I also know a little bit about guitars, having played for a few years in high school. I'm not amazing or anything, but I do know my way around a fretboard. So when the guy says he plays guitar in his band, I asked him which model and brand he prefers. He hesitates, then gives us some wishy-washy answer about having too many favorites to really choose from. Okay, nothing quite so suspicious about that. The guy must have had a whole bunch of guitars on hand. But I pressed the issue. I asked him if he'd ever played a genuine Les Paul, and he honestly looks at me like I'm speaking Greek. My BS detector is going off the scales at that. Everyone who plays guitar has some dream set up in mind, some god-tier piece of gear that they've longed to have placed on a pedestal. This guy had nothing. In fact, I was starting to think he knew nothing about guitars at all. I think he actually began to notice my suspicion, and this caused him to drop a little of that happy-go-lucky disposition of his. The guy actually started walking much faster through the crowds, turning around every so often to tell us to hurry up or we'll be late for the shoot. I turned to the girls around this time to tell them that I really didn't like where this was going. While they understood my concerns, they just thought I was being overly paranoid, that I should relax and see where the adventure would take us. But when he eventually leads us all the way to his run-down-looking warehouse building that did not look at all safe, they started getting similar vibes. There's garbage everywhere, gnarly-looking graffiti all over the walls. The place looked like it was a junkie's paradise. Remember, this is in the middle of the day and there's a ton of people around. Well, now we're way out of sight from the general public with this shady stranger who I'm convinced is up to no good. At these big iron entrance doors, he stops, waits, and then tells us to go ahead of him. The other two girls are giggling, way excited at the prospect of starring in some foreign band's music video, and just obey him like a pair of idiots. "Girls, we're not going in there. We're leaving." The words seemed to leave my mouth before I'd even realized I'd spoken them. At this point, the guy freaks out and stands in between me and my friends, trying to block their exit from the warehouse. You can see the fury in his eyes. Whatever nefarious plan he'd had for us, I'd obviously just thrown a spanner in the works. He's so overcome with anger that he's hissing at me not to ruin this for him, like flecks of spittle are flying from his lips and landing on me. It was disgusting. So gross, in fact, that I actually lean into a push, sent him flying off balance before I scream at my friends to get out of there. It takes him acting like a complete idiot for my friends to realize just what a scumbag this guy was, and at that, we're running away from his warehouse like it's on fire. The guy is yelling after us, shouting stuff about us not ruining this for him. This just makes us think he's giving chase, so we run faster and faster until we're back among the throngs of people, relative safety. I couldn't believe how dumb we were, and I told the girls as much. We swore we wouldn't tell any of the family what we had done. I have no clue what surprise was waiting for us inside that filthy warehouse space. I realized in that moment how naive I was, and to listen to my intuition, which has protected me many, many times throughout my life. What a bunch of idiots we were. After our university graduation, a few close friends and I decided to go traveling to Western Australia. We had planned the trip for years, putting away savings for our part-time jobs until the day we finally donned our mortarboard caps and ventured out into the world as adults. We arrived in country, spent a week or so just lazing around the beaches and soaking up the sun, then decided we'd have ourselves a little road trip. And for that, we'd need wheels. So we wandered into this little Aussie town and find ourselves the cheapest, noisiest camper van and rent the thing for basically pennies. We drove this battered old camper van around a few towns, often sleeping in the van itself when we were unable to find any hostels or hotels. Anyone familiar with the northwestern corner of Australia knows that town is a pretty generous term for most of these places, and there's a lot of absolutely nothing in between them, just barren outback desert. One night, after driving for hours and hours in almost pitch darkness, we decided it would be better to just pull over and get some sleep instead of risking getting lost in the outback. So we stop, drive off the road a little into this little dry patch of nowhere with no one around for miles and miles. We're tired, but we're happy. We're stocked up on food, cold beer, and now we've got ourselves a place to sleep. We've got it made. So after an hour or so around a warm fire, drinking and reminiscing about uni, we find ourselves staring up at the sky. It's an incredible vista. Lack of light pollution in that area of Australia means that the starlight canopy is a truly mesmerizing sight. But the place we're settled into is ringed by trees, so at some point, someone has the bright idea to go for a little wander so we can get a better view of the stars. It wasn't hard to find a good spot. The only trees around were nestled between the hills, hiding from the sun and sucking up any water that flowed their way. Manage to drag yourself up one of the slopes and you can see for miles and miles. I mean, Australia is so flat in places that it's like you're looking out to the ends of the earth. So with all of us a little buzzed, we start shuffling off towards one of these hills. It was glorious. The Milky Way was so bright and deep it felt like you were falling into it. The road and our campsite were hidden by darkness and trees, erasing pretty much all signs of civilization. We felt so alone, so far from home, it really was a special moment. We sat and drank in the galaxy and told whatever stories came to mind, just real hippie stuff. We were tiny specks in an immense universe and everything was perfect. And then it was time to go. We all stand up and as one, the 4 dudes I'm with start walking in the wrong direction. It's not hard to understand why. Every hill looked like the same from up on top of our glorious mound of rocks and dirt. Every little valley was choked with brush. The road was obscured from view and it curved gently away from us in both directions anyway. There were no landmarks and we were all high as kites. So there I am, confused at first as to why my mates are heading off in pretty much the opposite way we came. I doubt myself for a moment, wondering if it's me that in fact has the messed up sense of direction. The guys poke up a bit of fun, saying I'm too drunk to find my way back to the van, but I know at this point that we're definitely not going the right way. I start insisting, raising my voice, trying to convince the lads that they're about to get themselves dangerously lost in a place where getting lost can be fatal. They were so certain that they were going the right way that my objections were often met with laughter and mockery, but as time went on I became increasingly panicked. I could see this whole disastrous event unfolding before my eyes, so in a moment of clarity I just turned around and headed back in the direction I knew was correct. Now it was their turn to be insistent. The lads practically begged and pleaded with me not to go back in the wrong direction, drunkenly arguing that I was going to get us all in a lot of trouble. That infuriated me. The only one with any idea of where we were, and I was being treated like a moron. Eventually, they decided to humor me, following my lead so that they could continue to mock me when I finally did get us all lost. Every step of the way, they pointed out how unfamiliar everything was, how it couldn't possibly be the way we came. One of the lads even started babbling about how we were going south when we really wanted to be going north. He didn't even have a compass on him. In fact, I'm pretty sure that even if he did, he still wouldn't be able to tell his mouth from a hole in the ground. They left broken twigs and a trail behind us so we could find our way back, an idea that would have served us a whole lot better an hour or two beforehand. The one dude tried to physically drag me back to the hill and into the wilderness. They laughed at me, right up until we stepped out of a ditch and into the clearing where our camper van was set up. They weren't laughing then, I can tell you that much. The lad who was insistent that he had some kind of magnetic compass in his head was the worst off. He seemed flabbergasted, like the only explanation was that the camp had moved, not that we'd nearly gotten ourselves lost. I looked up this rest area later on Google Earth. Had we gone in any direction other than directly back to the road, it would have been over 120 miles before we hit any signs of civilization. If we were very, very lucky, 120 miles of Australian outback with no food, water, or tools. We'd have died, surely, and it only takes a few days without water before the body just packs in, and we were so dehydrated from the alcohol and smokes that I don't think that we'd have lasted a day alone in the outback. And that's the story of why I don't hike with drunks anymore. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. All links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Anthony is the captain now. And don't be narcissistic.